Shalom Aleichem. My name is Rabbi Paltiel, Yossi Paltiel. And thank you for bringing me to Florida. It's very hot in Florida, in case you haven't stepped outside. New York is not exactly cool, but Florida is another level. The event that we are commemorating, that we are celebrating, is 98 years old. 98 years is a very long time. It's a very, very long time. In 1927, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was arrested, imprisoned, then exiled, and then released over the course of a few weeks from the Soviet prison. When they arrested him, they planned to make short work of him. He was not supposed to live till the morning, literally. The plan was to shoot him before anybody could react. By the incredible grace of God and by incredible fortuitous, what we call hashgacha pratis, by overt expressions of the divine hand, he walked into the wrong room or didn't go where he was supposed to go. And by the time they wanted to end his life, there was too much noise from out of Russia. And that plan was foiled, and over the course of a short time, he was released. He could not stay in Russia beyond that point. First of all, it was far too dangerous to him. And second of all, he became the biggest obstacle. He, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, became the biggest obstacle to the underground activities that he was spearheading at that time in the Soviet Union, because it needed to become decentralized, and he was a center. So we left. That same year as October, and eventually he made his way to the United States. And we're here in Florida 98 years later, in no small part because of that miracle, because of this event. What I would like to do in this talk is give you a sense of what that world was like, what the previous Rebbe undertook, and most important of all, how it speaks to us. We live in a very different world. We can't even relate to that world. We have no concept of what the Soviet Union was like under Stalin and Yamach Shmei. We can't even relate to it, seriously, unless we come from there. But there is a timeless message in those events, in these events, and in this history, which is why we don't only talk about it, but we literally celebrate it. It's a holiday. It's a real, serious Yom Tov, this day of the liberation of the previous Rebbe from the Soviet prison and gulag and exile. And I hope in the few minutes that I have to be able to give you a sense of the history and to give you a sense of the viability of the now, of the dynamic nature of this history. But I need to begin with a story that happened in America, actually. It's an incredible story. It's a really wonderful story. The story involves two Jews. One was a young Chabad rabbi, and the other was a biology professor. The story happened in 1962, circa, a long time ago. Rabbi Moshe Feller, who should still live and be well, was a young Chabad representative living in the Twin Cities in Minnesota. He had just arrived with his young wife on their mission. And part of what he undertook at the outset of his mission was to try and meet as many prominent Jews as he could. He wanted to make acquaintances, he wanted to get to know people, and more importantly, he wanted people to get to know him. So we got a list. He was actually a native Minnesotan. He was born in Minnesota. He got a list of all the important Jews in Minnesota, and he one by one tracked them down and made meetings with them, introduced himself, told them what he is and why he's here. And of course, he hoped, A, that he would gain their support, and B, that he'd be able to teach them something. One of the men on his list was Professor Velvel Green, who was probably a few years his senior. Velvel Green has already passed away a few years ago. And Velvel Green was American, but very Jewish, extremely Jewish. He had a very strong Jewish identity. He grew up in a Yiddishist home. He grew up in a home where Yiddish was his first language. Yiddish was culture, it was not religion at all. And he had a very strong Jewish identity. but its Jewish identity was not a religious Jewish identity, it was a Jewish identity, it was a cultural identity. And if you have a strong Jewish identity, you don't need rabbis to help you with your identity. His identity was already established. Rabbi Feller called his office and asked for an appointment. Now, Velvel Green was used to rabbis from New York coming around asking for money, for schools and for all kinds of institutions. And he gave lots of tzedakah. People came to him all the time and he always wrote checks. The standard check was $18. Now, $18 in 1962 is $100 today. It's a lot of money. And if you were a person with a pretty nose, you got $25. And if you were a local charity, you got $36, which was an awful lot of money. So the secretary walks into Velvel Green and says, there's a rabbi on the phone who wants to meet with you. So without even looking up, Velvel Green says to the secretary, tell him he can come and pick up a check for $18, which was worthwhile in those days, 1962. She comes back a few minutes later and says, Professor Velvel, he doesn't want your money, he wants to meet you. Okay, tell him 25. So she goes back, it comes back a few minutes later, no, he wants to meet you. So Velvel Green figures he's a tough bargain, says, tell him 36 final offer. It's that, I'm not going above, I don't give anybody more than $36. She comes back again and says, he doesn't want your money, he actually wants to meet you. Okay, you don't want my money, fine. I can afford a half an hour of my time, but tell him he's wasting his time. I mean, I have my Jewish identity, he has his Jewish identity, and they're in different tracks. Our paths don't cross. We may come from the same roots, but we're going in different directions. He wants a half an hour of my time, he can have it. So Rabbi Moshe Feller shows up in the office of Professor Velvel Green, and he sits down. So for the first 50 minutes, Velvel Green is lecturing him. He's got to get rid of the black hat and the black suit and the beard, and he has to start looking like a Midwesterner if he wants to have any effect on the Jewish people in Minnesota. And Rabbi Feller very, very obediently and agreeably nods to all of the wonderful suggestions that Professor Velvel Green makes. And when he finishes giving him his lecture, now it's Rabbi Feller's turn to make his pitch. He wants to sell Lubavitch to him. He wants to explain to him what Chabad is. But you're talking now 63 years ago. Chabad was not then, but it is now, by a long shot. But as he begins to make his pitch, he looks out the window. And he realizes that it's getting late, the sun is about to set. And he hasn't prayed the afternoon service, he hasn't davened mincha. And Rabbi Feller, this meeting is very important to him, but davening mincha is more important. So he mutters to Velvel Green, I apologize, but I have a prior appointment. And without getting any permission, he stands up, puts a string around his waist, turns to face the wall, and talks to the wall for the next 7 or 8 minutes, basically talking away his meeting. He davened mincha instead of talk to Velvel Green. When mincha was over, the half an hour was basically up, and Rabbi Feller apologized for not taking advantage of the time they had together. He said, listen, I had to daven, I had an appointment with God, which came before my appointment with you. They overlapped, I had no choice, I had to daven mincha. And Rabbi Feller was certain that he would never see this man again. Rabbi Feller was certain this was the worst Chabad introduction ever given. And he left his office without a check, without making any impression, with the thought, I just laid a really, really nasty egg. What Rabbi Feller did not know was the following. Velvel Green and his wife, whose name is Gail, and as far as I know, she should live and be well. They lived in Israel at the end of their lives in Beersheba. Were very Jewish. And they belonged to a Jewish book club of academics, of intellectuals. A bunch of young Jewish academics would meet once a month and discuss a book on a Jewish theme. And at the end of each meeting, they would choose another book that they would all read. They would vote. There were suggestions made. They would vote on which book they would do. They'd all read the book. They'd come back a month later when they would discuss it, and then they would choose another book. This was their tradition. Literally a month or two before Rabbi Feller davened away his meeting with Professor Velvel Green, they had read a book by a writer whose name I do not remember, on what's called Gezedes Tachvetat, the pogroms of 1648 and 1649. The pogroms of 1648, 1649 are some of the worst in our history. There was a rebellion in what was considered then Greater Poland, which of course would slowly disappear. And by the 1770s, there was no Poland anymore altogether until after the First World War, as you know. And the rebels that rose up against the noble, the higher class, took out their anger on the Jews because the noblemen, the people with the land, had castles, and they locked themselves up in their castles, they protected themselves until they mobilized an army and they put on the rebellion. I heard from a medical doctor, a geneticist, that they killed 17 out of every 20 Jews, 17 out of every 20. Hitler killed 1 out of 2, 50%. 85% of the Jews of the Ukraine and that part of Eastern Europe were wiped out. Communities were wiped out to a person. They didn't leave a soul alive. Not one. But what was unusual, what was different about that pogrom was that every Jew was given a choice. The sword or the cross. You could be baptized and stay alive. Don't be baptized and lose your life. And by and large, the vast majority of the Jews in Eastern Europe then, you're talking 4 centuries ago, gave their lives al kiddush Hashem, to sanctify the name of God in public. They refused to even go through a formal, meaningless, external, coerced baptism, and they chose to give their life to God rather than cross that line. So imagine American Jews reading a book like that. People just like you. About thousands and thousands of Jews, hundreds of thousands of Jews, as many as 500,000, who would give their lives not to be baptized, not to, to have some water sprinkled on them, which is a meaningless act. And this group of American intellectuals, this group of young American academics, read this book. They gathered at the end of the month. They discussed this book. And the big question that they had was, are there still such Jews? Are there actually still Jewish people who would give their lives rather than go through a formal, meaningless, external act of baptism? And they all agreed that there's no such Jews. Jews who were so devout, who were so dedicated, who had such a clear sense of priority that they would die rather than go through this meaningless act of baptism. There was no such Jews. Well, Velvel Green watches Rabbi Feller talk to the wall for the duration of his meeting and then apologize for wasting Rabbi Feller's time and Velvel Green's time because he had to daven mincha. When Moshe Feller walked out of his office, Velvel Green picked up the phone and he called his wife. And he said to his wife, Gail, I found one. I found one. So his wife says to him, you found one what? He says, I found a Jew. She says, what do you mean you found a Jew? We're Jewish. He says, no, Jewish like the Jews in the book. I found a Jew who would give his life to sanctify the name of God in public rather than go through an act of baptism. This story started a lifelong friendship between Rabbi Feller and Professor Velvel Green, who became completely religious. By the time he died, he had a big beard. And one of the most extraordinary little parts of this long saga is that in 1985, at a gathering, at a public gathering, I remember it, I was there. Professor Velvel Green was standing behind the Rebbe, Rabbi Moshe Feller was sitting in front of the Rebbe, and in the presence of these two men, the Lubavitcher Rebbe repeated this story in the presence of them. The power of a Jew who did the right thing, even though it wasn't useful, but it was genuine, it was real, it was true. And the impact it had on an American Jew who couldn't value mincha, but he could value truth. He couldn't understand why a man would make a meeting with him and waste his time praying. But he knew this is the real deal. This isn't a game, this isn't an act, this isn't a formality, this is not social. This is deeply and profoundly true, devout, connected to God. And it touched him so deeply that him and his wife and their children changed their entire lives. And it was all initiated by this episode. I tell the story because I think it's the perfect segue to talking to us, to American Jews who are by and large free from fear and oppression in ways that are really historic. I mean, Jews today, with all the anti-Semitic talk, we have never been freer. We've never been richer. We've never had greater opportunity. I would say in the last 2,000 years, since the destruction of the Second Temple. That's my opinion. And we have a very, very different perspective on ourselves and on our history. And it creates a unique opportunity, and it creates a very, very, very unique challenge, a test to each of us. Now let me tell you the story of Beis Tamuz, the Hebrew date that begins tonight in the calendar is the 12th of Tamuz. We, Chabad Hasidim, and many other Jews over the world officially mark the 12th and the 13th days of Tammuz as a holiday, because it was on these days that the previous Rebbe was released from his exile, which followed his imprisonment. I want to tell you the story, at least in short. Jews in Russia never had it easy. Jews in Russia, in general, Eastern Europe was never good to the Jews. Western Europe, if you know history, was actually worse to the Jews. You just got to go back a little earlier to the 10th century, and the 11th century, and the 12th century, and the 13th century. You know, we look at the Eastern Europeans as big anti-Semites. Well, their educators were Germany and France and England and Spain. Jews never had it easy in Russia. They didn't. But there was a status quo. There was a status quo. There was an understanding that they're second class. There was an enormous amount of anti-Semitism. In Russia, in Tsarist Russia, anti-Semitism was used as a politique. Anti-Semitism was used as a way of dealing with dissatisfaction. When the population of Russia was rising up, because Tsarist Russia was very similar to the great Polish Empire. It was there was a noble class, which was 2 or 3 or 4% of the population that was extremely wealthy. And everybody else was so poor that they were almost indentured. They were like slaves for their lives just to pay their debts. And the Jews didn't fare very well in that world, but there was a status quo. And then there was a revolution, a very successful revolution. One of the most successful revolutions in history was the Soviet Revolution. The Marxist, it was really very successful. It was successful because it was carefully thought through, it was very well planned, and it was developed over the course of decades. The Marxist Revolution, which came out in 1917, had been going on since the 1880s. And many, many, many Jews saw this as their Messiah. They saw this as the way out of their oppression, the way out of the terrible burden of anti-Semitism that they lived under in the Tsarist Russia. But for whatever reason, and it really doesn't make any sense, Marxism or socialism or communism, which is an economic system, it has to do with how you distribute wealth, that's all it is, made a cornerstone of its approach, a cornerstone of its philosophy, the killing of God, the murder of religion. Why you have to destroy religion to create a different social system on an economic level, they ask themselves that question today. They don't understand why. It's just how it was. If you were a Marxist and you believed in what we call today the redistribution of wealth, you need to be secular. You're not allowed to believe in God. But it wasn't just that they didn't encourage faith in God. They had to kill God, and they did a very good job. They had to crush religion. So when the revolution occurred, many Jews ran over to that side. Many traditional Jews, Orthodox Jews as we would call them in America, because they had suffered so much. Their lives had been so difficult under the czars. And communism offered them equal rights. Officially, there was no difference between one person and another. I mean, they all ended up in the gulag anyway. They found out that anti-Semitism doesn't have to do with a political system, doesn't have to do with an economic system. It has to do with the fate of the Jewish people. Whoever is in charge is going to be anti-Semitism. And they suffered under the communists no less than they did under the Tsar. But they believed. They bought into the hope that there's opportunity. But unfortunately, a part of that revolution was to turn their back on God, to turn their back on their tradition, to turn their back on Judaism, and most painful of all, to turn their back on any Jew, turn their backs on any Jew who didn't believe as they believed. And this is one of the saddest parts of this story of Soviet Jewry, that in the early years, in the 1910s and the 1920s, the biggest persecutor of Jewish people were Jewish people. There was the Yevsektia. The Yevsektia is Russian for the Jewish section, the Jewish department within the Soviet government, that was later abolished, and all the leaders were shot by Stalin. But initially they were believers. They were believers because they felt that finally there's opportunity for Jews to be able to raise their head, to have a voice, to be involved in government, and to live like anybody else. And you know what? Nobody can blame them. You really, if you understand how much we suffered, you can't blame them. But as often happens, we made that mistake. A lot of us made that mistake. So there became a deep, deep identity struggle amongst Jews in what was now Soviet Russia, communist Russia, as opposed to Tsarist Russia, where many, many Jews became religiously committed to communism, which meant religiously committed to a war against all religion. Judaism, the Eastern Church, which was of course the religion of the state under the Tsars, and any other religions that existed in Russia. And the Jews who held on to the tradition, what we'll call the timeless Jew, the immortal Jew, the Jew who knows that Judaism doesn't change, God doesn't change, the Torah doesn't change, the world changes. The reality, the environment changes, the conditions change, the circumstance changes, but absolute truth is always absolute. And there began a period of terrible persecution. Terrible persecution. I'm talking now 1921, after the Civil War was over, 22, let's say. The revolution started in November 1917 in Leningrad, in Petersburg, and it swept through Russia from the very north to the very south. It was a terrible civil war. Many, 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 many Jews were murdered in that civil war by all sides. And when the Civil War was over, by 1922 approximately, there was opportunity for the Soviets to now consolidate their power. And the Jewish section of the Communist Party made it their business to close every shul, to close every cheder, to close every mikvatare, to close every institution that had any trace of Jewish faith, of Jewish religion, of Jewish practice, of Jewish tradition. And they did it cruelly, they did it quickly, they did it oppressively. And a lot of people who could ran away. They left Russia. It was very, very difficult. They ran away. They left the Soviet Union. They went to Poland. And many of them would lose their lives 20 years later in Hitler's war, Yamash Mevzechrei. The previous Rebbe stood and fought. And he screamed from the podium, where are the rabbis going? When there's a challenge to the Jewish people, the rabbis have to stand and fight. The Rebbe would say all the time that when a ship is sinking, the captain leaves last, not first. And all over Russia, which had the strongest Jewish tradition in any country in the world, people of prominence ran away, they left. And a vacuum of leadership was created that the previous Rebbe, with a handful of his Hasidim, tried to fill. And he did incredible underground work, incredible underground work. He sent people, individuals, his students, his former students, to reconnoiter the length and breadth of Russia, which is a very, very large country. and to find out what was happening in every Jewish community. Rabbis lost their homes because officially being a rabbi, being clergy of any type was not a job. And in the Soviet Union, if it didn't work, you were a nobody. If you were a worker, then you were everything. This is the Soviet system. And they were impoverished. And many of their former parishioners, many of their former members turned against them because they believed in this hope, in this promise that this was going to be a new world, the latest Messiah. There have been 1,000 Messiahs. And they're all false, unless they're connected to the unchanging truth of Torah mitzvahs, of practice, of Jewish practice, and Jewish thinking, and Jewish living. And the Rebbe began to plug holes. Where a rabbi left, he sent one of his students to be a rabbi. Where the school was closed, he opened a little cheder in the underground. Where the mikveh was closed, he opened a secret mikveh. And many, 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 many of his students were arrested, sent off to Siberia, and quite a few, including relatives of mine, never came home. And they left widows and they left orphans. But the previous Rebbe believed that this was a moment for defiance. And that's really the essence of the story. What do Jews do when they have challenge? What do Jews do when they have challenge? There are two kinds of Jewish challenge. Thank you. I have my coffee over there, now I have my water over here. Okay, I won't drink either of them. Both of them. The 2 cups will keep me company. I need the coffee, yeah. What do Jews do when they have challenge? So we have 2 kinds of challenge that are represented by 2 very important holidays. There's a physical attack against the Jews, which is represented by Purim. And there's a spiritual attack against the Jews, which is represented by Hanukkah, right? You know the stories of Purim and Hanukkah. Purim was an attack against the Jewish bodies. What did the Jews do? They prayed. Hanukkah was an attack against the Jewish soul. What did the Jews do? They fought. The way I like to say it, and it's really painfully sobering, when someone attacks a Jew, it's God's business. When someone attacks God, it's the Jew's business. And that moment in the Soviet Union, 1922 and 1923, the previous Rebbe made the decision that he's not running away. He's going to stand and fight. He's going to stand and fight. And he had built a yeshiva 25 years before. And however it worked out, did he know what was going to happen? Did he build it in anticipation? The students of the yeshiva that he personally raised as their principal, as their educator, now became his generals and his lieutenants in this war to keep Judaism alive in Russia. You must understand, ladies and gentlemen, this is very personal to me. I have a father, and he's alive and well. And he was born in Moscow. He knows what I'm telling you, not because he heard it from anybody, but because he lived it. I'll just tell you one story from my personal family, which it makes my hair stand up. My father had a brother who's now deceased. He was older than he was. My grandfather, who I knew, worked at the central bank in Moscow. He was very well educated, and he was an Orthodox Jew, and he worked for the Soviets. His son would come home from school, and they had no mother. Their mother had died. So he would go to his father's office, and he would lean over his father's desk. Try to imagine this, a kid of 8 years old, 9 years old. He would lean over his father's desk and whisper to his father. He would talk to him. And that's how he prayed mincha. That's how he davened. Do you imagine? That's how he davened the afternoon service in a room full of communists. He was talking to his father after school. This is real, and it's to a great extent very personal. And the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, said, we're going to fight. And I'll be direct with you. It was a fight they couldn't win. You're not going to defeat the Soviet Union. And I don't think the previous Rebbe fought this battle to win. He fought this battle to fight. This is the story of this holiday. Just like 22 centuries ago, The Chashmonaim fought a war they could not win in any world. And it was a war of defiance. It was a war of principle. If you desecrate God, if you desecrate what is precious to God, the Jew says, I'm going to stand and fight, as a statement of defiance to he or she who wishes to desecrate what is holy and what is sacred and what is true. And of course the story of Hanukkah was that this incredible miracle happened. And that's why it's a holiday that we celebrate every year. That's what we're celebrating. Well, in modern times, the previous Rebbe's battle against the Soviets was a latter-day Hanukkah story. It's exactly what it was. He told his Hasidim, we're going to stand and fight. And I cannot tell you how many lost their lives in fighting this battle. There's a time, there's a moment, which fortunately for all of us is not today. When a Jew digs deep and he finds inside himself the courage and the integrity to say some things are worth dying for. Some things you have to stand on principle. The previous Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name I carry, Yosef Yitzchak, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Neresen, fought the Soviets defiantly and even brazenly. He was daring them. He was daring them to arrest him. Because he was a very prominent figure. He was very well known inside of Russia and outside of Russia. He stood up to Stalin and he lived to tell the tale. Few people have that good fortune. He dared the Soviets, and specifically the Jewish communists, the Evsektia, to stop him. He was going to teach Yiddishkeit until there was no blood in his veins. The previous Rebbe had a gathering in the spring of 1927 at a Purim Fabringen, tore open his shirt, and he pointed at his bare chest, and he said to his Chassidim, who loved him very deeply, if you see this body burning, don't stop teaching the children. Don't stop teaching the children. And they arrested him. They arrested him in, I guess it's May of 1927. The same night that he was arrested, they arrested 20 clergy people from all religions, all over the Soviet Union, and they shot every single one of them. They were telling the world, the Soviets were telling the world, we're not afraid. The Frierdiker Rebbe didn't show up to his bullet. He sat in the hall and smoked a cigarette. I mean, the story is hysterical. It's unbelievable. He was told to go to a certain room, and he said, but they didn't tell me what time, right? So he sat down on a bench to smoke a cigarette, and somebody walked out of an office and knew who he was and asked him why he was there. He said, well, he told me to go to room 60. He says, that can't be, because he knew what happens when you open up the door to room 60. And that's how his life was saved, a cigarette. So much for cigarettes being dangerous, huh? The frame of this story is that when the previous Rebbe in the Soviet Union fought Stalin, he fought the communists. Number one, I don't think he believed he could win. It would take an enormous miracle. But he felt like you have to fight. This war you have to fight. This war you have to fight. Number two, for himself personally, he had no exit strategy. I believe, and I don't know if it's true, but I believe that the previous Rebbe never expected to come out of there alive. That wasn't his plan. He was going to fight and give his life for Judaism, for the timeless truth of our faith, what the Maimonides calls Das HaEmes, the religion of truth. God saved him in spite of himself. He was completely reckless with his life. He was defiant and outspoken. He was a leader. He was a presence. He was a voice. He was a time and a place in the Soviet Union that everybody knew about, that was overtly and directly defying the Soviet Union. It wasn't clandestine. The people who worked with him were clandestine. He was out in the open. He dared them to stop him. And they tried. They tried. They put him in jail. They tortured him terribly. They tortured him unbelievably. The beatings that he took are hard to read. He describes them himself in his own account of his 18 days that he spent in the Soviet prison. He was held for 18 days, for 2.5 weeks. The original plan was to shoot him. And then that was suspended. Once word got out that they had arrested him, there was too much pressure from out of Russia. So they wanted to send him away to 10 years of slave labor in Solovki. I don't know what that is. And that was also crossed out, and they sent him away for 3 years of exile in Asia, in Russian Asia, in a city called Kostroma. He spent 9 days there. That was his 3 years. And at the end of 9 days, he was told that he's free to go. He went back home. So I'll just tell you a little detail about the story, which is very compelling. In the Soviet Union, that a 6-day work week, the day of rest was Tuesday. They didn't want to make it on Shabbos. God forbid the Jews should be able to keep their Sabbath. They didn't want to make it on Sunday. God forbid the Christians keep their Sabbath. So they made it on Tuesday. So Tuesday, a cable arrived from Moscow, which was the capital under the Soviets, telling the leadership of the KGB in Kostroma, where he was exiled, that the previous Rebbe is being released. Somebody met him in the street and told him, Rabbi, a cable came that you're free to go home, but the offices are closed, so you're going to have to come in tomorrow morning and register. He was supposed to register every Wednesday that he was an exile who hadn't left the city. So the following day, which was on a Wednesday, it's the same arrangement as it is this year. This year, Yud Beis Tamuz is Tuesday, the 12th of Tamuz is tomorrow is Tuesday, and the 13th of Tamuz is Wednesday. It was the same exact arrangement. So because of Stalin, we got 2 days Yom Tov, not one. You see, by moving the day of rest from Sunday to Tuesday, so he was told unofficially that he's free to go on the 12th of Tamuz, which is tomorrow, which happens to be his birthday. And he was told officially that he's free to go home the following day, Wednesday, so Chabadnik has got 48 hours to Fabreng. I'm in Florida to Fabreng. Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. Every night there's another celebration. We celebrate this holiday. We celebrate his survival. He celebrated his survival because he saw his survival as a divine act. He saw the fact that he came out of the Soviet system alive as a message from God, which amounts to your efforts are not in vain. All that sacrifice, all that risk-taking, all that courage is not for nothing. That's how we interpreted it. It's 98 years since. Tomorrow is 98 years since he was told unofficially that he's free to go home, and Wednesday is 98 years since he was officially allowed to leave. Chabad Hasidim the world over, and many people affiliated with this way of thinking, honor these 2 days. We don't say tachlan. We don't confess. We celebrate them as holidays. They're holidays that they really are a latter-day Hanukkah. That's what they are. They're a story of a few Jews who stood up to one of the mightiest empires in the world. Did they win? Did they win? How many Jews did we lose in the Soviet Union? How many millions of Jews were assimilated? They didn't lose, that's for sure. But most important of all, they fought. They fought. They stood up. They didn't hide. They fought. They fought. And you know, the Soviet system lasted about 70 years, a little more than 70 years. When that system was over, the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of those Hasidim who had started that fight with the previous Rebbe in the 1920s were still fighting. I was in Moscow in 1988, and I met a first cousin of my father's, who was one of the great leaders of the underground in Russia for his whole life. When I met him, he was 80. And around him was a whole following of young men and women who were Bali Tshuva. They were not even raised traditional. They were not raised frum. They were not raised Orthodox, as we call it in America. Who under the Soviets found God. Under the Soviets looked for truth. And they would come to shul and say, teach me. And in the Soviet system, when someone came to shul and said, teach me, you were afraid to teach him. What if he's an agent of the state? And you would delay him and you would delay him. You imagine a guy comes to a Chabad house. He wants you to put on film and you're afraid to put film on him. What if he works for the KGB? How do you know if he's sincere or not? There was a whole game they had to play till they had to ascertain the integrity of every single Jew, boy and girl, who walked through the doors of the shuls all over Russia in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and said, teach me, give me a bris. Give me a bris, adult men and women. Women don't do a bris. Adult men, a bris. It's not fun. And they would come into the shul and ask for Yiddishkeit, and the people would look at them like as if they were strangers, and they would spend months until they were trusted, and then they would learn Aleph Beis, and they would learn Hebrew, and they would learn how to daven. And many of these people built Jewish families in the Soviet Union. And the Rebbe, our Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Schneer's, who would mark, this was his Rebbe, the previous Rebbe was our Rebbe's Rebbe. He would mark this day with a great celebration. And he would always speak to the fact that the defiance and the sacrifice that the previous Rebbe showed all those years ago was the reason that even now, and I'm talking now, I mean the 70s and the 80s and the 60s, when he would talk about this, there are Jews who are holding on to their tradition, trying to retain their identity, trying to grow under the nose of the communists. This is what we are celebrating. It's a powerful story. It's moving. At the very least, it's very, very moving. Here's the problem. How do we, American Jews, Western Jews, relate to something like this? It's such a foreign concept to us. Our biggest problem is assimilation. Our biggest problem is that the Gentile neighbor is our best friend. Our biggest problem is that we don't have any problems. We're free. And yet we struggle. We struggle with our Jewish identity for a very different reason. You know, one of the biggest mistakes all anti-Semites made historically was to try and use oppressive means to destroy the Jew. You use oppression against the Jew, you make them more Jewish. You use assimilation. It works like a charm. Look at America. The question that we ask ourselves of how, if in any way, does this story and does this event and does this holiday have a relationship with us? How is it personal to me? And the answer to that question is that it's always true that every single one of us, every single Jew, is in a position to be one of those that stands up and is counted, is one of those who says, I'm going to do the right thing, not the convenient thing. I'm going to do the right thing, not the popular thing. I'm going to do the right thing, not the mainstream thing. It's a very different world. It's a very different challenge. Same God, same Torah, same mitzvahs, and the same Jewish people. I would argue that as the previous Rebbe fought for the education of children, Stalin didn't mind if the shuls were full of people as long as they were retirement age. He didn't want kids in shul because he was a viciously evil man, but he understood that as long as there are no children in shul today, the shuls will be closed tomorrow. Taking children to shul was one of the worst crimes. And I want you to know, my grandfather took my father to shul, which I find incredible. My father was inside what's called the choir shul in Moscow that's still there today. You can go and visit it. It's been renovated and beautified. My father was in that shul as a child many times. My grandfather would sneak in the back door. He was taking a great risk to his life to take his 3 children. Remember, he was a widower. He had no wife. My father doesn't remember his mother. So my grandfather raised his children alone. He took them to shul. They didn't want the children in shul because they understood as long as the kids are not involved in the religion will die. This is our challenge. There's a lot of tradition. There's a lot of seeking meaning. One of the greatest challenges to the American Jew is raising our children Jewish. Raising our children, little kids, who we want to entertain and protect and make peaceful and comfortable and safe and give them all the amenities of life, all the pleasures of life. The greatest things we can give our children is what our parents gave us. God, tefillin, Shabbos, kosher, to be Jewish in the same way that our ancestors were for thousands of years. Judaism is timeless. And because it's timeless, as old as it is, it's never old. And we have this test. You know, there's a very famous story, I don't know if you're familiar with the story, that in Germany, in the 19th century, there was an enormous amount of assimilation, an enormous amount of assimilation. And Rabbi Hirsch came to Rabbi Hirsch, the famous Rabbi Hirsch. You know the Hirsch Chumash. He wrote many, many books to create a philosophical / scientific approach to Judaism, which he wrote, of course, in German, because he was trying to reach German Jews and wake up their souls. He came to Frankfurt, and he gathered all the girls, all the young women, and he spoke to them about mikveh. He spoke to them about the family purity, about a Jewish woman using the mikveh. And the purpose of using a mikveh is to live a Jewish life in the most intimate part of your life and to bring Jewish children into the world kosher, the way God wants. And he got up and showed in front of all these girls, and he explained to them what mikveh is, and he explained to them the importance of mikveh, and explained to them how special it is and how holy it is, and how it has a great blessing effect on our children. And then he asked, does anybody want to be the first volunteer to use the mikveh? And not a single girl volunteered, not one, not a one. And after he asked a few times and nobody moved, he went over to the ark, he pulled open the curtain, he pulled open the doors, and he stood in front of the Sefer Torah, the Horus Scrolls, and he said, I swear that any girl who stands up and commits herself to use the mikveh, I guarantee her that she will have long life, she will have great health, and she'll have great wealth, and she'll have beautiful children. And one girl stood up, one. And then another. And then another, 3 girls. And the entire Frankfurt Jewish community came from those 3 girls. And he kept his word. The promise that he made in front of the open holy ark was actualized. There are people who knew those women. They actually lived, and they lived long. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the relevance of this holiday. It's very personal. You know, being a Jew is very personal. But the problem with being a Jew is also very social. It's a community activity. You don't want to be more religious or less religious than the guy next to you, right? You want to be right where everybody else is. But everybody has the test, the challenge, the opportunity to be one of those that are counted. Who says, I'm going to be a leader. I'm going to be a Jew the way God wants. I'm going to keep all the mitzvahs. I'm going to keep Shabbos. And then another person follows, and another person follows, and another person follows. You don't necessarily get the credit, but you created the ripple, the trigger, that set in motion a series of events, which translates into another mitzvah, into another mitzvah, into another mitzvah. I want to share 2 stories with you. There's a man in Crown Heights who I know him socially. I know him because I saw his picture in a book, and the next time I saw him, I virtually embraced him. I pounced on him with every way except my body. I said, oh, I'm so happy to meet you. His name is Cohen. If you will meet him, we'll say, nah, not me. He means somebody else. I want to tell you a story about this Mr. Cohen. And I don't care that I'm saying his name. Okay, let you all go find him and look him up and embrace him. He's a simple man. He's a professional. He's a businessman. He has a wonderful life. But he was born in the Soviet Union. And his grandfather was a big tzaddik. His grandfather was a famous chacham, a Sephardic rabbi, who was deeply involved in the work of the underground. And in the Soviet Union, if you were involved in the underground, whether you liked it or not, you were Chabad, because Chabad were the unified presence. They were the community, so to speak. And this was his Zayde, his grandfather. His mother was a professional. She was a dentist. She was an Orthodox woman. And in Russia, you didn't tell your children to keep Shabbos. You didn't tell your children to put on film. You explained to your children they should keep Shabbos. And then you prayed. You explained to your children that they should study Torah. You explained to your children that the poisonous rhetoric of anti-God that they hear in school they should not allow themselves to absorb. But you couldn't force them. You can't force children ever. But in the Soviet system, this boy had to go to school. School was 6 days a week. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Shabbos. Shabbos you're not allowed to write. The teachers were very aware of who was a Jew. The teachers were very aware of whose parents were religious. And Saturday they paid attention. Did the kid show up? Did he write? Imagine being 12. And all your friends are looking to see if you're going to write on Shabbos. Huh? And every week you have to come up with another excuse why today I can't write. One week it's a toothache, one week my hand is broken, the next day you don't come to school. But you can't play games forever, and at some point the pressure builds. So this, I think his name is Moshe Cohen, went to school and he would write on Shabbos. And his mommy did not patch him when he came home for writing on Shabbos. She just explained to him that on Shabbos you're not allowed to write. At the age of 14, after his bar mitzvah, 14 is little, people. I think we know that. He decided he's keeping Shabbos. He's keeping Shabbos. Now this is the person that I know physically. Last summer I spent the Shabbos with him. This is an actual human being that's walking terra firma earth as we speak. He made a decision that he's keeping Shabbos no matter what. His parents didn't force him. It was his own choice. So the game started. You know, 1 week he didn't come. The next week he got sick. The third week there was something else. But at some point he had to go to school. And there was an exam. There was a test that was scheduled for Saturday. He came to school with his face wrapped in a scarf. His tooth is hurting him. His tooth hurts him so much that he's not able to write. Now his teacher knew exactly the game that he was playing because he played it every week. And the teacher said, today you're going to write. Today's an exam. You have to write. I don't hear any stories. He says, my tooth hurts. So he said to the teacher, okay, let's go downstairs to the infirmary and let the dentist examine your tooth and we'll fix your tooth. Now his tooth didn't hurt. So you go down to the infirmary, the dentist examines him, and the dentist says, which tooth hurts? And he points out one tooth at random. And the dentist says, okay, let's pull the tooth. And Moshe Cohen says, my mother's a dentist, for heaven's sake. My mother is a dentist. My mother can pull my tooth. No! If you're not going to write today, we're going to pull your tooth. A 14-year-old boy. And they had no Novocaine. They had no painkiller. They pulled this boy's tooth without any painkiller. So he should not write on Shabbos. It's an actual story of an actual person who I know. And when I saw him after I read the story in some book, to me, he's a hero. I'm a nobody. This was life in the Soviet Union. We don't have such tests. Our test is that we don't have such tests. And the challenge is to know that Judaism is always true, always. And it's on each one of us as individuals to stand up and be counted, as the previous Rebbe did in the 1920s in the Soviet Union. I'm going to finish with one more story and then I'm going to stop. I suppose after this we're going to go into the other room and have a fabrengen. I don't know what the program is, but this is my formal speech. But I'm going to ask you a favor. After I finish talking, I would like to sing several nagunim. Please sing with me, because if I sing alone, I'm not much of a chazan. It's going to be a terrible concert. But it is a fabrengen, it's a Hasidic gathering. This is a little bit formal as opposed to what we've done in the past when I've been here. But I'd like to end this meeting with, I want to sing two songs, which I'll explain to you in a moment. But before I do, I just want to tell you a story. There's a rabbi in South Africa whose name is Rabbi Lapin, Rabbi Lapine. Rabbi Lapin, he's not a Chabadnik, he's not a Lubavitcher. In the 1970s, he had been fortunate enough to go to Israel and learn in a yeshiva. And he came back to South Africa. He married and he settled there. He was from South Africa originally. And he joined one of the large congregations, one of the large shuls in Johannesburg. And he saw that there was an enormous lack of engagement with religion and an enormous lack of Torah classes, of Torah studies. So he started to teach. He gave one class to 3 people, another class to 2 people, and people flocked to him. Over time, the number of classes he gave and the number of people participating in his classes grew. Now, he was a businessman who was working very hard to support his family, and his quote-unquote rabbinate was a volunteer job. He became so exhausted that he decided to liquidate his business and dedicate himself to the rabbinate full time. And he flew to New York to meet the Rebbe in the 1970s to discuss this with the Rebbe. And he told the Rebbe, I am a businessman, I've made some money, I'm prepared to close my business because I see the need to teach, and I can't do both, I'm just exhausted. And the Rebbe, in typical Rebbe form, told him, quote, more rabbanos, more business, do more rabbinate, more business. He says, Rebbe, I can't handle what I got. And the Rebbe said, no, you keep your business open because people listen to a rabbi differently when that rabbi earns a living in a way that's independent from his role as a rabbi. So he said to the Rebbe, Rabbi, I love your opinion of me, but what you're describing, I can't do. I simply cannot do it. I'm falling apart. I'm collapsing. So the Rebbe said to him, you know what your mistake is? Your mistake is that you view a meeting between one Jew and another that involves religion. A meeting between one Jew and another where one Jew puts on tefillin with another Jew. One Jew teaches Torah to another Jew. One Jew encourages another Jew to keep Pesach or Shabbos. You view it as a chemical reaction. You have one chemical, one element, it's stable. You have another chemical, another element that's also stable. You bring them together, they interface, they interact, and there's a reaction. And after the reaction, there's a new normal. The chemicals find a new balance, and the reaction stops. Every act of Torah and mitzvahs is not a chemical reaction. It's a nuclear reaction. It creates ripples, what they call a chain reaction. Every act has multiple actions that come from it. And we may look at ourselves and think, what can I do? How can I change the world? I'm a little nobody. What we must appreciate is that every good deed that we do begats additional good deeds. And the more time that passes, the more good deeds come from one initial good deed. And the Rebbe says, if you'll look at your life that way, you'll see that you can do more. And there's time for everything. So Rabbi say, ladies and gentlemen, you've listened to me very, very well. I appreciate that. I want to sing with us together 2 songs.
That's a short announcement. Just want to make sure we're doing the Nigunim shortly, but we divided the evening into 2 phases. Phase 1 is going to be the lecture. We're going to do the Nigunim, whichever Nigunim the Rabbi is going to lead. And then shortly after, we're going to transition to the social hall. We're going to have the traditional setting with Fabrengen. So everybody please stay. The evening is not over.
Okay. So that's your first challenge. Huh? Am I sticking around or am I getting out of here? Okay, think about it. That means we're going to sing 2 songs. The first is a Hasidic melody which was composed by Chabad Hasidim in Russia to celebrate the previous Rebbe's release from prison. The second is one of the most sacred songs in Chabad. It's called the Alter Rebbe's Nigun, the song of the great Rabbi, the founder of Chabad, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi. It's the song that we sing at weddings. It's called the Song of the 4 Stanzas. We don't sing this Nigun on ordinary days. This is a special day. I would like you to sing with me because, like I said, if I sing by myself, it can be a disaster, okay? And there's no music, so it's on us, okay? So we'll sing first the Nigun of Beis Tamuz, and then we'll sing the Nigun of the Alter Rebbe, and then we'll go into the other room. Now we'll sing the Alter Rebbe's Nigun, okay? Please sing with me, please, please. This is probably more familiar to more of you. ya 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 da da. Oh yeah da da, oh yeah da da da, yeah da da, ah yeah da da, yeah 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 da, yeah da da, ah yeah da da, yeah 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 da da. Ah yeah da da, ah yeah da da da, yeah da yeah da, ah yeah na na, yeah 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 da da, yeah 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 yeah. Ay 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 ay. La 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 da la 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 ya de ma la 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 ya la 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 ya de ma la 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 ya la 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 ya de ma ya 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 ay 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 ya de ma 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 ya da ya da ya da ya la 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 la.